I came here today to solve one of the most interesting questions I've ever been asked. While sitting in my U.S. Studies class, my teacher prompted the class by asking us whether we thought the Sons of Liberty should be considered terrorists or patriots, and no one, including my teacher, was able to fully answer the question. So this left me pondering this question for days on end. And when it came time to pick a social studies fair topic, I knew that this question was made for me to answer. So to start my research, I had just learned in class that the Sons of Liberty were an undercover group, who met at night, and they were secret. They were secret because they didn't want Great Britain finding out that they were meeting. So to start, I looked up the definition of a patriot, and the best definition of a patriot is one who has great love for one's country. The next thing I did was I looked up the definition of a terrorist. And a terrorist is someone who uses harmful tactics to push an agenda or overthrow a government. So while this helped, it didn't solve my question. So the next thing I did was I sent out a survey to my peers, and the first question I asked was, without using the words terrorist or patriot, what is one word that comes to mind when you think of the Sons of Liberty? And here are some of the most interesting answers. So the next question I asked was, if you had lived during the American Revolution period, do you believe you would have been a patriot or a loyalist? So 77.2% believe that they would have been patriots, while 22.8% believe they would have been loyalists. And the last question I asked was, do you believe that the Sons of Liberty were patriots or terrorists? 82.3% believe that they should be considered patriots, while 17.7% believe that they should be considered terrorists. So while this really did help me answer my question, it wasn't the full answer that I was looking for. So the first thing I want to look at today is the terroristic actions of the Sons of Liberty. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Liberty Tree. So the Liberty Tree got its name from the Sons of Liberty because it was where they would meet at night because they had to be in secret. So the Sons of Liberty would often find government officials, specifically stamp collectors and tax collectors, because of the Stamp Act that had just been passed due to the French and Indian War that left Great Britain in poverty. Because the stamp collectors and tax collectors were taxing the colonists to oblivion, the Sons of Liberty did not like them. So they would find paintings or pictures of those officers and hang them on the tree. They would then mock and gawk at those paintings until they were done, and then they set them on fire. So the next thing they did was tarring and feathering. So that included those same people that we just talked about. They would go after those people physically. They would strip a victim of their clothing, pour hot tar on them, put feathers all over them, often put the victim on a wooden stick, carry them around town, and whipping them until they were out of town. So the last terroristic action I want to look at is what I consider the harassment of government officials. And we're going to take Andrew Oliver, for example. So Oliver was a newly hired tax collector. And like I said, they did not like them because of the Stamp Act. So the Sons of Liberty did not tar and feather him, but they went after his home. They harassed him until it messed with his mind. And then they, like I said, went after his home. They cost over $10,000 in today's damages to the interior of his home. And the harassment became so hard for Oliver to deal with that he resigned. And there's a newspaper clipping here of the Sons of Liberty inviting everyone to come see the resignation of Andrew Oliver. So the next thing we're going to look at is the patriotic actions of the Sons of Liberty, and we're going to start with the Boston Tea Party. Now, while the Boston Tea Party might seem like a bad example, when you look at the reasons behind the Boston Tea Party, it's actually a really patriotic act. So at this point, the Stamp Act had been repealed, which pleased the Sons of Liberty, but now the tea tax had been enacted. So the tea tax meant that the colonists could only buy tea from Great Britain and that they could tax however much they wanted on the tea. So what the Sons of Liberty did was they snuck into the Boston Harbor one night and dumped 46 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. This showed Great Britain that the Sons of Liberty were done with their rubbish. So the next thing is the Boston Massacre. So one day they were outside the Customs House. There was a pretty peaceful protest for what the Sons of Liberty had been doing. And it was being guarded by 8 British officers. All of a sudden, all 8 fired into the crowd. They killed 5 colonists, and when they looked into the reasons behind why the British officers would have fired, there was no reason. So this showed that it wasn't just the Sons of Liberty and the colonists causing trouble. So the last thing we're going to look at is how the Sons of Liberty fought for freedom. Today we know that the Sons of Liberty were stepping stones for America. Without the Sons of Liberty, we would not be here as a country. They were a group that believed in so much, and they were not going to let something slip through their fingers. So after all this information gained, I've come to the conclusion that there is not one simple answer. The Sons of Liberty were such a complex group that is not up for one person to decide. So I ask you, after hearing all the information about the Sons of Liberty, do you believe that they are patriots or terrorists?